Agnes Porter woke to the low wail of the wind and the thud of something sharp and painful deep in her belly. The cabin creaked, with groaning under the weight of another restless night. Darkness pooled thickly around her, only pricked by the dim orange glow of embers still smoldering in the hearth. She lay there, rigid and sweating despite the chill, her hands clutching her stomach as if by holding herself together she could somehow press down the panic rising through her like floodwater. It was absurd, of course. A woman of 55, wrinkled by age and worn by years of work on this rough patch of land her late husband had called God's own proving ground. Pregnancy was something she'd left behind decades ago, a closed door that had locked itself with time. She had not lain with a man since Josiah had been buried, his name carved into a slab of rock on the hill where the grass grew tangled and wild. But the signs were unmistakable. Nausea, sharp and crippling, curling her over the edge of her cot. An unfamiliar tenderness in her breasts. And now, the subtle swell of her stomach beneath her nightdress, as if her own body had turned traitor. A betrayal wrapped in absurdity. Yet, in that quiet dark, there was no denying what she felt. When the morning light bled through the gaps in her walls, Agnes rose stiffly and washed her face in the basin by the window. Her fingers trembled as she braided her gray-streaked hair, her eyes refusing to meet her own reflection. What little food she managed to force down turned to stone in her gut, the sour taste of fear lingering. By mid-morning, she saddled her mare and rode into town, the familiar ache of exhaustion dogging her every step. Dusty Ridge was a place of suspicion and superstition, where a woman like her was meant to remain solitary and respectable. Anything else drew stares, sharp as broken glass. They watched her as she tied her horse outside the general store, watched her as she haggled over salt and flour, her voice strained and low. Their eyes scraped over her with curiosity sharpened by the weeks of her seclusion. She had kept to her land for so long, hiding from their judgment. But nothing stayed quiet for long in a place like this. "Morning, Agnes," the storekeeper greeted, his smile thin and uncertain. Mr. Wilkes, a man built like a stick of kindling, his shoulders hunched from years of counting pennies and counting sins. "Morning," Agnes replied, her words clipped and dry. Her eyes stayed on the shelves, avoiding the faces of those who loitered near the counter, their conversation dropping to a murmur when she entered. "Been a while since you came around," Wilkes continued, his gaze slipping over her with the kind of curiosity that made her skin itch. "Busy," she lied. "Harvesting late." Wilkes nodded, though his fingers twitched against the counter. Dusty Ridge was a town that fed on secrets, and hers was already bleeding out, leaving a trail for the scavengers to follow. When she left the store, the whispers followed her like a bad scent. Mrs. Calhoun, her mouth twisted into a permanent sneer, spoke loud enough for Agnes to hear. "They say she's gone mad, talking to herself out there, just like old Josiah before he fell to ruin." "She's cursed, that one," another voice chimed in. "Seen her stumbling around at night, clutching her belly like something's growing inside her." Agnes gritted her teeth, her hands clenched around the reins as she mounted her horse. She forced herself to ride slow through the center of town, her spine iron straight, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The eyes of Dusty Ridge burned into her back like coals. The preacher's voice boomed from the chapel as she passed, his words steeped in fire and brimstone. Reverend Callahan, the town's self-appointed moral judge and executioner. His sermons had grown louder of late, more fervent and wild-eyed. Agnes caught the edge of his voice as she rode by, something about the wicked being cast down from God's grace. Her stomach twisted, a sickly pulse of dread hammering against her ribs. She didn't believe in curses or punishment from above, but she knew what it meant to be cast out, to be branded as something wicked. Back at her farm, Agnes worked until her muscles burned, chopping wood and mending the fence where the storm had torn it loose. The labor kept her thoughts at bay, dulled the gnawing fear that had taken root deep within her. But as the sun began to sink below the hills, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, the pain in her belly returned, sharp and insistent. She collapsed against the rough-hewn table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was as if her body was fighting against itself, something pulling and tearing within her. Agnes gritted her teeth until she tasted blood. The days slipped by, a fever dream of work and pain and whispers carried on the wind. The town's rumors grew louder, twisted into tales of witchcraft and devilry. Children were forbidden to walk near her property, their mothers clutching their arms as they hurried past her land. She stopped going into town. The solitude became a shield, but it could not keep the sickness at bay. Her body swelled, her skin pulled tight and aching. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the wild around her cabin, the coyotes howling, the owls calling, the rustle of leaves against the brittle earth. One night, as the fire crackled low and her eyes drooped heavy with exhaustion, a knock rattled the door. Agnes sat up, her pulse thundering. No one came to her land, not at this hour. The knock came again, harder this time. She reached for the rifle propped against the wall, her fingers curling around the cold metal. But when she spoke, her voice was nothing but a rasp. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a voice, low and rough-edged like gravel. "Agnes Porter. I reckon you remember me." She hesitated, the familiarity of that voice sinking into her bones like poison. But it couldn't be him. That man was gone, dead or run off years ago, leaving only the scars of his betrayal behind. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning under the weight of time. And there he stood, shadowed by the moonlight, his eyes steady and calm. "Samuel Cutter," she whispered, the name tearing itself from her throat like a curse. He tipped his hat, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble, Agnes. And I reckon I'm the only one who can help you." Her grip tightened on the rifle, her heart a frantic drumbeat. But there was something in his gaze, something that made her chest hitch and her knees quiver. Desperation tangled with suspicion, and for the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope. Or perhaps just another kind of madness. Agnes held the rifle steady, her hands trembling only from the effort of keeping herself upright. Samuel Cutter lingered in her doorway, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she recognized him well enough. A drifter, a hunter, a man who once dealt in lies and ledgers when Dusty Ridge was still carving itself from the earth's hide. It had been years since she'd last seen him, when Josiah was alive and the world had made sense. And yet here he was, standing on her porch like the devil himself had sent him to taunt her. "I don't need your help," Agnes said, her voice sharp and jagged, like splintered glass. "Whatever you've come here for, you can turn right back around and leave." Samuel didn't flinch. His eyes were the same color as iron, hard and unforgiving. He stepped forward, his boots grinding against the floorboards. "You're wrong about that, Agnes. You need help more than you know." "What do you want?" she snapped, though her fingers loosened on the rifle. His confidence rattled her. Dusty Ridge bred cruel men and broken men, but Samuel Cutter had always been something else, a man with purpose, even if that purpose was steeped in sin. "Only to talk," he said. "If you want me gone after, I'll go. But I reckon you'll want to hear what I've got to say." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between the rifle and his eyes. Then, with a reluctant exhale, she set the gun aside. "Make it quick." He stepped inside, the cabin's warmth gathering around him like a shroud. Agnes lit a lamp and the light spilled over his face, revealing more years etched into his skin than she remembered. His hair was shot through with silver, his jaw still sharp but lined with something that looked like remorse. "People in town are talking about you," Samuel began, settling into a chair as if the place was his own. "And from what I saw on my way in, they're more than just talking. They're watching." Agnes clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Let them watch. I've got nothing to hide." He lifted an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Don't you?" She glared at him, but the fight was leaving her, sucked away by exhaustion and the dull, persistent pain in her belly. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her shoulders hunched. "You said you had something to tell me. Spit it out." Samuel leaned forward, his elbows braced on his knees. "You've been feeling unwell, haven't you? Sick, sore, like something's eating you up from the inside. She stiffened, suspicion creeping through her veins like poison. How would you know that? Because I've been looking into some things, he replied. People who don't have any business sticking their noses into the lives of folks like you. Powerful people, wealthy people, and I'm afraid you've caught their eye. Why? Agnes asked, though the words sounded frail, thin as thread. He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and creased from travel. When he laid it on the table, she saw it was a letter, written in a hand too fine and precise to belong to any man she'd ever known. Harold Beckett, Samuel said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. Rich man, lives up north in an estate the size of Dusty Ridge itself. Word is, he's been conducting experiments, twisting the natural order of things, trying to force life where it has no place growing. Agnes stared at him, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Experiments? What kind of madness are you talking about? The kind that leaves women like you pregnant when they've no right to be, Samuel replied. His gaze was cold and steady. Beckett's been buying men, doctors, scientists, men of learning who've turned their backs on God's work for greed and vanity. He's been sending them out here, testing their poisons and potions on whoever's too poor or desperate to refuse. The words clung to her like the scent of rot. You're saying I was poisoned? Not poisoned. Altered. His jaw tightened. I can't tell you how, but I've seen the aftermath of his work, and it never ends well. Agnes's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table. Why me? I've never even heard of this Beckett. He heard of you, Samuel said, and of Josiah. Something about your land, the way you lived, isolated, away from prying eyes. An easy target, or so they thought. The mention of Josiah's name hit her like a fist. The man she'd loved, whose memory she'd clung to even as her own body turned traitor. She narrowed her eyes. And how do you know all this, Samuel? How do I know you're not just feeding me more lies? Because I was hired to find you, he admitted, his voice thick with regret. Beckett put a bounty on you. Said he needed his subject, recovered before things got out of hand. But I looked into it. I saw what he did to others. Couldn't bring myself to sell you out, Agnes. Even if it meant walking away from the only money I was likely to see this side of a coffin. So you just decided to help me out of the kindness of your heart, she scoffed, bitterness curdling her words. Kindness. He laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. No, I've got my own ghosts, Agnes. Reckoning to make, debts to settle. But when I learned what they'd done to you, well, I figured I might as well put a bullet in my own head if I didn't try to make things right. She wanted to hate him, to drive him from her home with curses and fire. But something in his eyes, wounded, desperate, yet unwavering, kept her rooted in place. What are you suggesting? She asked, her voice brittle. I'm suggesting you let me help you, Samuel said. Beckett won't stop hunting you. Not until he's sure his little experiments played out. But if we go to him, make him answer for what he's done, maybe you'll get the peace you deserve. Agnes looked away, her gaze drifting toward the cracked window where the night pressed against the glass like a living thing. And if I refuse, then you'll keep wasting away out here until there's nothing left of you but bones and bad memories. He didn't soften his words, didn't try to coax or comfort, just stated the truth as plainly as if he were reciting scripture. She closed her eyes, her breath shuddering from her lungs. For so long, she had clung to her grief, worn it like armor. But now that armor was rusting, falling apart beneath the weight of this new, unspeakable horror. All right, she whispered. I'll go with you. But if you're lying to me, Samuel Cutter, I'll see you dead before the sun rises again. His smile was grim but genuine. Fair enough. They prepared through the night, her belongings gathered with trembling hands. As dawn crept over the horizon, Agnes stood in the doorway, her cabin a ruin of shadows behind her. Samuel waited by his horse, his expression solemn. Together, they rode away from Dusty Ridge, the unknown stretching before them like a wound waiting to be healed. The journey north was a gauntlet of wind and dust, the air brittle with cold that cut through their clothes and scraped against their skin. Agnes rode in silence, her shoulders stiff, Her eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. Samuel kept pace beside her, his presence both a comfort and a threat. She distrusted him still, though the desperation that clung to him like a shadow made her believe he might be telling the truth. Whatever had driven him to seek her out, it had twisted his soul into something restless and raw. Their campfire burned low that night, flickering shadows dancing across Samuel's face as he sharpened his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Agnes sat opposite him, her back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. She chewed on a piece of dried meat, her appetite dulled by anxiety. "How much further?" she asked, her voice carrying a thread of impatience. "2 days' ride, maybe 3, Samuel replied without looking up. "Beckett's estate is tucked away in the hills, where nobody thinks to look. That's how he likes it." Agnes snorted. "Rich men always do, building their castles where no one can tear them down." He glanced at her, his gaze searching. "You think this is just about money? About power?" "It's always about money and power," she snapped. "I've seen men lie, cheat, and kill for less than a handful of coins. What makes this Beckett any different?" "Ambition," Samuel replied. "He's not just another tyrant trying to carve out his own little empire. He's trying to remake the world, to twist nature to his own liking. And he doesn't care who he has to break to do it." Agnes felt a chill creep down her spine, colder than the night air. "And you're sure he's the one who did this to me?" "His men, his work," Samuel said. "But he's the head of the snake. Cut him down, and maybe this all ends." She studied him across the firelight, her eyes hard and unforgiving. "And what's in it for you, Samuel? Redemption? Vengeance?" He smiled, but it was a grim, humorless thing. "Maybe a bit of both. Maybe just the satisfaction of knowing I did something worth a damn before I meet my maker." They lapsed into silence, the crackling fire their only conversation. Agnes stared into the flames, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had no illusions about her chances. Beckett was a man of means and cruelty. If he had truly marked her for his twisted designs, then she would find him and make him pay, or die trying. By the 3rd day, the hills rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their slopes covered in dense pine and underbrush. The air grew colder, the sky grayer. Beckett's estate lay hidden beyond those hills, its vastness rumored to be guarded by men more loyal to coin than to conscience. They reached the edge of the property by nightfall. Agnes peered through the branches, her gaze fixed on the sprawling mansion that loomed like a fortress against the darkening sky. Lanterns burned along the walls, their light a pale imitation of day. The estate was surrounded by a high iron fence, its spikes tipped with rust and cruelty. Samuel crouched beside her, his breath misting in the chill. "There'll be guards patrolling the grounds. Beckett doesn't leave anything to chance." "And you have a plan, I assume?" Agnes's tone was sharper than she intended, but the nerves twisting her insides made her voice brittle. "We sneak in through the west entrance," Samuel said. "Servants' quarters. Less security. Once we're inside, we find Beckett and make him answer for what he's done." "And if we don't find him?" Agnes asked, her fingers brushing the pistol she kept strapped to her hip. "Then we burn the place to the ground," Samuel replied. His eyes gleamed with a feral intensity that both unnerved and inspired her. They moved under the cover of darkness, their steps cautious and soundless. Agnes's heart hammered in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of her own frailty. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the grim determination that had carried her this far. The servants' quarters were a warren of narrow hallways and low ceilings, the air thick with the smell of sweat and stale bread. Samuel led her through the maze with the certainty of a man who had spent his life navigating danger. They slipped through a kitchen where the remains of a meager supper lay scattered across a long wooden table. Voices drifted from an adjoining room, laughter mingled with the clink of glass. Agnes felt her skin prickle with tension, but Samuel's hand on her arm kept her steady. Upstairs, the grandeur of Beckett's wealth revealed itself in polished marble floors and oil paintings framed in gold. The air was cool and perfumed, a sharp contrast to the earthy scents of the servants' domain. They crept through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Agnes's breathing grew shallow, her mind torn between terror and fury. All her pain, all her isolation, traced back to this man. A man she had never met, yet who had found a way to invade her life with cruelty and indifference. A door at the end of a hallway stood slightly ajar, and from within came the murmur of voices. Samuel nodded to her, his expression hard as stone. Agnes pressed herself against the wall, her hand tightening around the pistol's grip. They moved closer, inching toward the door until they could peer through the gap. Inside, Harold Beckett stood by a tall window, his silhouette framed by moonlight. He was a man in his 50s, his hair silvered but his posture regal. His eyes glittered with an arrogance that sent a surge of anger through Agnes's veins. Beside him stood another man, lean and sharp-featured, his expression that of a predator. They were speaking in low tones, but Agnes caught enough words to stoke her fury. The experiment was a failure, Beckett said, his voice smooth and cold. The subject will perish soon enough. Another miscalculation, but progress nonetheless. And the bounty hunter? The other man asked. Cutter? Likely dead or soon to be, Beckett replied with a dismissive wave. He was useful until he turned traitor. No matter. We'll continue the trials elsewhere. There are always more willing subjects. Agnes's blood boiled. The casual cruelty, the utter disregard for the lives he had destroyed. She nudged Samuel, her eyes blazing with resolve. Now, she whispered. They burst into the room, guns drawn. Beckett spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. The other man lunged forward, but Samuel shot him down with ruthless precision. Beckett stumbled backward, his composure cracking. What is the meaning of this? Agnes aimed her pistol squarely at his chest. You did this to me. You stole my life. Now you're going to pay for it. He sneered, though his voice trembled. You're nothing but a failed experiment, a creature destined to be discarded. Agnes's hand trembled, rage and grief warring within her. But she kept her aim steady, her resolve unshaken. You're the one who's failed, she said, her voice cold and certain. And you're not leaving this place alive. Beckett's eyes widened, his arrogance melting into terror. Samuel's voice cut through the air, harsh and final. Do it, Agnes. End this. Agnes's finger hovered over the trigger, her pulse a thunderous beat that roared in her ears. Harold Beckett stood before her, his eyes darting between her and Samuel with the desperation of a man cornered. The arrogance had slipped from his face, leaving only a pale, quivering mask that stoked her fury like dry tinder to a flame. "End this?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "You think it's that simple, Samuel?" "It's as simple as justice," Samuel replied. His gaze locked on Beckett like a wolf eyeing prey. "He did this to you, Agnes. All the suffering, all the pain. And he'd do it again without a second thought." Beckett's mouth twisted into a sneer, his lip curling as if he couldn't help himself. "You think you're righteous, woman? Coming here with a gun and a grudge? You're nothing more than an anomaly, a failed experiment. You should thank me for what little life you have left." Her grip tightened, knuckles white against the polished wood of the pistol. "You think what you did was some kind of gift," she spat. "You tore my life apart. You left me suffering in the dark, wondering if I'd gone mad. And for what? Some twisted pursuit of power." "Power is everything," Beckett said, his voice growing steadier, more confident. "And I was close, closer than any man before me. A child born from one who could not conceive, brought forth by science where nature failed. You were a testament to my brilliance, even if you were too weak to see it through." "I am not weak," Agnes growled, the words coming from deep within her chest. "And I am not yours to control." The shot was deafening, the recoil snapping her arm backward. Beckett cried out, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had torn through flesh. Blood seeped between his fingers, darkening the pristine white of his shirt. He staggered backward, colliding with the edge of his desk before crumpling to the floor. "Damn you," he shrieked, his voice high and thin. "You've doomed yourself. Without me, you'll wither away, nothing but a rotting corpse waiting for the worms." Agnes stepped forward, her gaze cold and unwavering. Better that than living as your experiment. He looked up at her, eyes gleaming with hatred. You think killing me will end this? Others will follow in my footsteps. There's profit in it, power beyond your reckoning. Maybe so, she said, her tone flat. But they won't have you to guide them. She lowered the pistol, her hands shaking now that the rage had spent itself. The weight of her actions settled on her shoulders, but it was not guilt she felt. It was something closer to relief. Samuel moved to her side, his eyes never leaving Beckett. He's not dead. Not yet. You want me to finish it? Agnes shook her head, her fingers still curled around the grip of her pistol. No. He'll face justice the right way. I won't become what he tried to make me. Right way. Samuel's lips twisted in a grimace. Men like him don't face justice. They dodge it, twist it by it. Killing him now would be a mercy. Maybe so, she admitted. But if I kill him in cold blood, then I'm just another monster. I need to be better than that. A groan from Beckett drew their attention. His face had gone ashen, blood pooling beneath him. But his eyes were still sharp, calculating even in agony. You'll regret this, he gasped, his words punctuated by shallow, wheezing breaths. Letting me live, it'll be your undoing. I'll take my chances, Agnes replied, her voice as hard and cold as the steel in her hand. They bound Beckett with strips torn from his own silk curtains. His feeble attempts at protest, nothing more than pitiful murmurs. Samuel's hands were steady, his movements efficient and unyielding. When they finished, Beckett lay on the floor like some wounded beast, his once gilded power stripped down to blood and bone. Agnes met Samuel's gaze, searching his eyes for doubt or resentment. Instead, she found only a weary acceptance, the kind of resignation that comes when a man has seen too much of the world's cruelty. We need to leave, Samuel said, his voice low. The guards will notice something's wrong soon enough. Agnes nodded, her body moving on instinct even as her mind spun with 1,000 unanswered questions. They slipped from the mansion under the cover of darkness, their steps swift and sure. Samuel's knowledge of the grounds proved true, and they were clear of the estate's perimeter before the first alarmed shout pierced the night. Their horses waited where they had left them, tethered among the trees. Agnes swung into the saddle with a grunt, the pain in her belly a dull ache that throbbed with every movement. Samuel glanced at her, concern flickering across his features. You all right? He asked. I will be, she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. Just need to put some distance between us and that damn place. They rode through the night, the hills swallowing them whole. Agnes let the cold air scour her lungs, each breath a battle against the pain that pulsed within her. Her thoughts drifted between the memory of Beckett's sneering face and the weight of her own choices. Mercy had never been her strong suit, but something in her had refused to grant him the clean death he likely deserved. They made camp near a shallow stream, the dawn breaking pale and gray above the treetops. Samuel built a fire, his hands working with mechanical precision. Agnes watched him, her gaze tracing the lines etched deep into his skin. You think I made a mistake? She asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Samuel stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. Maybe. But it was your mistake to make. She nodded, her lips twitching into a faint, weary smile. I suppose that's true enough. For a long time, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire their only company. Agnes felt the exhaustion seep into her bones, but beneath it lay something unfamiliar. A sense of control, of ownership over her own fate. She had confronted the man who had stolen her life, had chosen mercy when vengeance had seemed so easy. As the sun crept higher into the sky, she glanced at Samuel. You'll leave, won't you? Go back to whatever life you were living before all this. I'm not sure there's much of a life left to go back to, he admitted. But I reckon I'll keep moving. Can't seem to stay in one place for long. Then what will you do? Agnes asked, her voice soft but firm. Now that this is over. Samuel shrugged, his gaze never straying from the fire. Try to make amends, I suppose. Help where I can. And if trouble follows me, well, I'll handle it. Agnes nodded, her chest tight with something that felt too much like grief. But as the fire crackled and the day grew brighter, she realized it wasn't grief at all. It was hope, fragile and unfamiliar, but alive. "You've helped me," she said. "More than you know." Samuel's smile was faint but genuine. "Maybe I was just paying a debt. Or maybe, just maybe, I was trying to do something right for once." They broke camp not long after, their paths destined to diverge. But as Agnes watched Samuel ride away, his figure shrinking against the endless horizon, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. Her body was still frail, her future uncertain, but her spirit, her will, had never been stronger.